Good evening. Hենրի Թերիոյի, Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs at Western State University, past President of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, will be doing an interview with the public TV tonight. Mr. Theriot, thank you so much for this opportunity.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.
Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh have been in partial and in full blockade for roughly 8 months now. No humanitarian aid, no international organizations have had access to Nagorno-Karabakh. Hunger is on the doorstep. Baku calls this reintegration. Yerevan calls this ethnic cleansing. What, in your estimation, is going on in NK?
I think as many scholars and other experts have come to accept and come to believe, this is really an extension of a genocidal process, begun obviously a century ago. Azerbaijan has become a full participant. They had some involvement, again, Azeris, 100 years ago, to the extent that they had an identity at that time. But we are now seeing them on the leading edge of an attempt to erase the Armenian presence, I have to say, not just in Nagorno-Karabakh, but in Armenia, in the Republic as well. We see the invasions of Armenia, we see the targeting of Armenians, and the rhetoric coming out of both Baku and Ankara is very clearly about eliminating Armenians.
Mr. Theriot, the international community believes that this is simply a humanitarian crisis. What makes you go for the term genocide?
Well, first of all, the context, this is not happening in a vacuum. The 2020 war and the blockade, 8 months ago and continuing today, are happening within a broader context of repeated attempts to eliminate the Armenian presence in Nagorno-Karabakh. We know the history throughout the Soviet period was an attempt to de-develop the area, to push Armenians out, to prevent economic opportunities and so forth. And ultimately that escalated in the late 1980s into direct violence against Armenians in various areas of Azerbaijan, a clear attempt to eliminate the Armenian presence. We also, of course, know the history of broader genocide against Armenians by Turkey and its supporters, including Azerbaijan. So I think that's one piece of it. But there are two very important contemporary pieces. Even if we ignore the historical backdrop, the actual actions in history, both state leaders, Turkey and of Azerbaijan, have stated explicitly their desire to eliminate the Armenian presence. Whatever Azerbaijan is saying to international entities under certain circumstances, the rhetoric is absolutely clear. They want Armenians out of that area. And then if you go beyond that, Azerbaijan is claiming large parts of Armenia, including Yerevan. They are stating very clearly that the Armenian presence is illegitimate, that Armenians are not indigenous to the area and so forth. Again, completely against any historical fact. And they have been explicit in stating that elimination of Armenians is the goal. So in that context, and they have put this into action. They have killed Armenians. We are still seeing in a so-called period of ceasefire, killings of Armenians, kidnappings of Armenians, and now we are seeing what scholars often call a genocide by attrition through the blockade, where you don't use direct killing, but similar to the Darfur genocide, you use means that prevent communities, prevent targeted groups from eating, from having medical care, from having shelter, during winter months, energy and all those kinds of things. And while this is not a very slow process, we're seeing already the crisis in Artsakh after 8 months. It is a way to commit genocide without direct killing. So those are the reasons. And I think, as I've said, and as I know you're aware, different scholarly groups, different scholars and others have now been clear about what's going on as a one-sided attempt at mass violence against the targeted group Armenians.
Days ago, the first death by starvation was reported in Nagorno-Karabakh. 40-year-old man was starved to death in the 8 months of the region's blockade by Azerbaijan. The Human Rights Defender's Office in NK said Hovhannisyan died of chronic malnutrition and protein and energy deficiency. Your comments on this, please. Is Baku weaponizing hunger?
Absolutely, and this is not new with Baku. This has been a tool we have seen again and again and again in, as you point out, what are called humanitarian crises that almost never are. When you see starvation, it is almost always the case that is politically driven. It is about targeting groups by preventing them from having access to food that would otherwise be available to them. And there's no doubt that that's the case here. There just can't be any doubt at this point that this is leading to the destruction of the Armenian community in Nagorno-Karabakh. And this unfortunate death is the first. I hope it's the last, if we can get an international settlement, something to change the facts on the ground. But if that blockade is not lifted, if Armenian rights in Nagorno-Karabakh are not protected, this will unfortunately not be the last death.
Baku denies the blockade in the very face of facts, denies weaponizing hunger against Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. How would you comment?
I am a co-editor of Genocide Studies International. It's a peer-reviewed academic journal. We've got a special issue that has just come out on the Lachin blockade. And one of the articles is by journalist Lindsay Snell, who might be familiar to you. She investigated all of the claims about the basis of the blockade. That is, who is the actual people participating in the blockade, where they come from, how they're supported. And it is extremely clear that these are state-sponsored, state-supported individuals who are acting on behalf of the Azerbaijani state and on behalf of its government. They're being rewarded in various ways. Many of them are ex-military or other government officials. As she points out, younger participants at university now see this as a great route towards civil service jobs in Azerbaijan in the long term, and so forth. And there can be no doubt that this is a state-run, state-sponsored blockade. And on top of that, all the rhetoric about, free movement and it's not preventing, on the ground, the evidence is clear. And the shells in the background are clear. This is a blockade meant to starve out, to prevent Armenians from being able to live in Nagorno-Karabakh after a millennia-long presence there.
Along with other prominent genocide scholars, you have submitted a joint letter to the UN that is, in essence, a call to prevent the genocide in Nagorno-Karabakh. What's the effect you expect this call to have?
I won't say I expect. My hope is that this prevents what happened in 1994 in Rwanda. I think we're all familiar with the UN's really intentional inaction in 1994 as Hutu extremists were targeting the Tutsi minority within Rwanda and Hutu moderates. As this genocide was happening, it was mischaracterized as a mutual ethnic conflict, a civil war. It was a humanitarian disaster, and so forth and so on, very similar terms to what we're seeing today. And the net result of that was inaction after inaction after inaction by the UN and by member states that allowed a genocide to occur. Unfortunately, I think we're seeing the same kind of inaction by the UN, the refusal, as evidenced by the Security Council hearing on this case last week, which was extremely disappointing in having no results and essentially, to use your words again, mischaracterizing this as a sort of humanitarian crisis rather than an act of genocidal aggression. My hope is that this is another piece of pressure that will shift the UN into some kind of decisive action. I will add that we can't forget that the ICJ International Court of Justice has issued an order that has been on the books now for 6 months, that the blockade must be lifted by Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan has not lifted that blockade. It is a hope that with these kinds of pressures that the UN and its member states will actually take action to prevent this mass atrocity that's unfolding in front of us.
The prevention of genocide and safeguarding vulnerable populations stand as fundamental obligations of the global community, as underscored by the UN Charter and the Genocide Convention of 1948. What viable mechanisms does the UN have to prevent another genocide in the 21st century?
Again, there would have to be member state participation, but a clear decision by the Security Council that intervention to end the blockade is necessary and legally sanctioned would be a huge first step. That would likely take member states to actually commit personnel to end the blockade, that is to remove the blockade, and to protect the free movement of people and goods in both directions on the along the Lachin corridor. That would be fairly decisive action. We've already seen, unfortunately, that an ICJ decision, an order binding by international law, has had no effect on Azerbaijan, and I believe that only through a direct I hesitate to use the word peacekeeping, especially given the failure of the Russian peacekeeping mission, but a direct intervention to remove the blockade is really the only effective mechanism that the UN has left. Economic sanctions, unfortunately, are not particularly viable because a lot of member states are getting energy from Azerbaijan, and as individuals, they're not willing to give that up. Again, decisive action is really what's needed and really what's left as an option.
Mr. Theriot, if the UN fails to act in NK, where would that land Western values?
Well, I think it will reinforce and yet again show the hollowness of principles like the responsibility to protect, which says that when a government that supposedly has control over an area of population doesn't protect its population, the world community has a right to intervene. And when an aggressive state targets a group outside its borders, regardless of the geopolitics, the world community has an obligation to step in. And that responsibility to protect vulnerable groups, such as the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh, against aggression, external aggression, is being put to the test right now. If that fails, then we really see that the basic principle of protecting vulnerable groups against mass violence has failed yet again. I don't think this is new, unfortunately. I think we've been seeing it continually, really since the UN came into existence. But this will be a case, I have to say, this is a case that is so blatant. Remember, we're talking about Armenians who have already experienced, I would argue, the 1915 genocide and the 1894-96 massacres that I also believe are genocide. This is already on the book. I mean, this is not a question. And this victim group, already weakened by this history of genocide, is now in a position where the international community is failing to follow through on the most basic of its values.
Do you see other mechanisms of preventing the genocide in NK besides what you already enumerated?
Absolutely. I think there are political solutions that are very straightforward. Obviously, if Russia stepped up, this would be over in a day. In other words, if Russia committed to the ending of the blockade, there would be no question that blockade would be lifted. As we know, Russia's preoccupation with Ukraine, coupled with the use of Azerbaijan as a way of laundering Russian energy, oil, and so forth through Azerbaijan so that it can escape sanctions, is a huge problem right now in the geopolitical outlook. In addition, the United States and other, I'll call great powers, European powers, absolutely could step in and say enough is enough. If the United States withdrew its massive military support to Azerbaijan, I believe this would end overnight as well. Right now, the Azeri leadership, Aliyev and others see themselves as being able to act against Armenians with absolute impunity. They have prosecuted an aggressive war. They are trying to destroy an Armenian presence on a part of its homeland. And the United States has done nothing substantial to change the fact that the U.S. is arming Azerbaijan to do these things. It is done nothing. So if my government could step up, again, no military intervention on that level is necessary. Just withdraw the military support, withdraw the diplomatic support, and say enough is enough. This would be done very quickly.
Do you see any signs that the Biden administration might withdraw its military support for Baku?
I don't see that, unfortunately. I think there are some great leaders in the U.S. who are pressuring that administration to change policy, to do this. People like Jim McGovern of my area. And unfortunately, the calculation that's being made and the rhetoric coming out of Washington right now is very clearly is not even putting that on the table. And I think that's a shameful position for my government to be taking, especially when we know the most effective genocide prevention is removing the weapons from perpetrators, stopping the support for perpetrators. This is easy. The U.S. and Russia both have very easy ways to deal with this, and neither is willing to step up. It's kind of interesting that this often gets pitched as a sort of West versus East, Russia versus U.S. issue, but both of them are acting in the same way, and both of them are harming Armenia right now.
As a genocide scholar, what is your message to your own administration, to the global community, to UN dignitaries that are responsible for and equipped for preventing genocide?
The positive message is this is an opportunity to do what's right, to use all the mechanisms to make good on the rhetoric that we have heard from various sources, the United States government, other governments, the UN, and so forth for decades about preventing genocide, mass atrocity, whatever they want to call it. I don't care. I want to save lives, and I want to ensure that Armenians have the right to be in their homeland as full human beings. So that's the positive message. The negative message is if they don't step up, this really shows and exposes, unfortunately, yet again, the hollowness of the values that these different groups claim to represent. And I think the damage to the UN, especially going forward, will be significant. Here is an opportunity to do what's right and to show it can have an effect. And with legal backing, the ICJ decision is absolutely clear. There's no ambiguity here about lifting the blockade. And yet the UN is not stepping forward. And if it doesn't, it just really, I think, will further weaken the UN's viability as a meaningful international actor in the support of human rights. And that's bad for all of us.
Mr. Theriot, thank you for your frankness and for your courage to step up for vulnerable populations for the protection of their rights. And thank you for doing this interview with the Public TV.
Thank you for the opportunity, and I can only say, whatever small part I can play, I really feel deeply for the people of Nagorno-Karabakh, and I just, I hope that some of these possibilities really have some effect and improve their conditions.
Hhenrì Therioy, past president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, gave an interview to the Public TV tonight.